going to talk about our third and final time period, which is going to be 1815 to 1914. And the big event that happens that starts out the course description is going to be about the Industrial Revolution. So for those of you who like to follow along using the course description, we're going to look at 6.2, 6.3, and 6.4. It's going to be a pretty long video today. Okay, so the Industrial Revolution really begins in earnest in the 19th century. We're going to see a tremendous growth in the economies and industrial capacity of many European nations, right? So the first thing that we're going to do is we are going to look at the factors that influenced the development of industry from 1815 through 1914. All right, and so the first thing we want to talk about is the causes for industrialization and where it starts and where it spreads to. So obviously the first place we're going to talk about is Great Britain, which was really the first nation to undergo the processes that led to industrialization. So why did Great Britain take the lead? Well, first of all, the most obvious explanation is that they had the resources that were necessary to industrialize. They had the ability to access those things. And so in England, for example, there were large supplies of coal that could be used as an energy source for the machines in the factories. Also, they had large amounts of iron ore that they could mine and develop. And they had other raw materials like cotton through their colonial connections with the American South, although not a colony, certainly a supplier. India was a big supplier of cotton for the British, as well as Egypt. So Britain had all the necessary materials readily available for it to undergo industrialization. And of course, remember, textile production was the first area in which industrialization occurs. Secondly, and this is going to build off the first thing that I was talking about, the British are going to develop industry in textiles, and that will lead also to growth in iron and steel production, in transportation as well. Those are the first areas that we see really develop during the first Industrial Revolution. In a second, we'll talk about the second Industrial Revolution. So this is where we see Britain really take an early lead. They will begin to do those things. Industrialize in textiles, a development of iron production in particular, steel's a little bit later, and then also transportation. And in this, we're talking about the laying of railroad tracks, connecting markets to port cities, connecting mines and areas of raw materials to the factories, all those sorts of things. Now, another reason why England might have been the first to industrialize has to do with the political and social climate that existed inside of England. We've already talked about how in the 17th century, England underwent a civil war that eventually resulted in the Glorious Revolution that created a limited constitutional monarchy, a society with basic protections and civil liberties for the citizens, a protection of private property that encouraged capitalist investment. And so we are going to see England has the political climate in place, which encourages economic activity. And so there was a commercial spirit that existed amongst wealthy British. The nobility there were less traditional, less old-fashioned, more willing to take commercial risks and invest in businesses and things like that. Plus, because of Britain's exploration and colonization and developing global network, there are also going to be wealthy merchants, bourgeois people who are going to invest in businesses. And because Britain protects private property, because government can't act arbitrarily, it encourages the development of industry. What we're going to see in England, as opposed to other places later on, is that industrialization in England is mostly the result of private initiative. It's not really government directed. Basically, Britain creates a system where individuals can pursue their own self-interest in economics, and they do so, and it results in the development of new machines and inventions that allow for industrialization to occur. Some example of these things: the Crystal Palace was built through private initiative. It was made of, if you remember, steel and glass, easily mass-produced by the British economy. Banks are going to form in England that will provide loans and capital to aspiring entrepreneurs to develop their businesses. And the British government is also going to offer support to inventors, copyright, trademarks, protecting inventions through patents, things like that. So a lot of private initiative going on in England. The rest of Europe, it's going to be a mixture of private initiative, but also government direction, as we shall see. All right, and the most obvious statement we're going to make today here is that the British government was very friendly to commercial interests, mostly because members of parliament had commercial interests, right? So in a representative government, the people who make up the representatives are going to be favorable to their interests. So wealthy businessmen and nobles are making money from business. Parliament is made up of wealthy businessmen and nobles. Ergo, they will pass laws that are conducive to those commercial activities. The best example of this that you see, and College Board loves this event, it is the repeal of the Corn Laws. The Corn Laws had been passed prior to industrialization. It set tariffs on imported foodstuffs. It was done to protect the nobility, the landowners, and when this is repealed, it's showing a shift in Britain's economic leanings and in the interests of Parliament because the entrepreneurs are going to favor laissez-faire economic policies. And they're going to look at the Corn Law and they're going to say that is unnecessary regulation of the economy. Government should play as little role as possible in that. And so that will get repealed. All right, then industrialization is going to move on to the continent. As other places see the advantages of industrialization that Britain is gaining, they are going to copy, right? France is going to follow suit, but France's industrialization will be more slowly undertaken, and that will lead to less dislocation of traditional practices. That's a phrase directly out of the course description. And what we're saying here is that it's not going to go overnight from family economy, cottage industry, domestic system to the factory system. There's going to be a gradual phasing in of these things, and artisans, people who make products, aren't going to be as immediately challenged and displaced from their important positions. It will happen eventually in all places, but it's much more slowly occurring on the continent and in France in particular. All right, now the government is going to be very supportive of industrialization as well, and a lot of it has to do with building of infrastructure. We're going to see canals being created and built by the government, choo-choo lines being laid down, and then of course there is also going to be trade agreements that the French government will enter in with other countries, allowing for trade to take place. Now, Central and Eastern Europe are going to lag way behind Western Europe when it comes to industrialization. These things don't occur uniformly nor at the same time. And so what we're going to see is that Central and Eastern Europe are going to remain much more traditional. There's going to be a lack of resources that don't really allow for industrialization to take place. They don't have the energy, materials, the coal, or they don't have the raw materials like raw cotton to turn to textile factories. And they're going to lack transportation. Their railroad building is going to lag behind Western Europe's. We are also going to see that the aristocracy in Central and Eastern Europe are much stronger, and they're going to be hesitant to change their economic practices, which basically involve ownership of land that is labored on by a captive labor force. Serfs is what I'm referring to here. So landed aristocracy much stronger in Central and Eastern Europe, and their economy is really dependent upon serfdom, and they're going to be very hesitant to give up that sort of way of life. And then last but not least, just a lack of either government interest or involvement. They just don't have the same motivations to keep up with the West. They prefer keeping things the way they are, mostly because these are absolute monarchies still, and they're going to be reliant upon noble support. And so they don't want to anger their nobles, right? British czars, in exchange for boyar political obedience, are basically going to give the nobles, the boyars, carte blanche to do whatever they want with their serfs. Okay, so despite all these changes that are taking place during industrialization in the early part of the 19th century, we will see continuity in some regards. We will see some primitive agricultural practices persist. And I was getting to this when I was talking about Russian serfdom, right? Russian serfs are going to use the same farming methods as their uh, 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 their ancestors had done, and there's not going to be a movement to adopt new farming practices, nor will there be the machinery that we see in other places that will allow for that to happen. The Irish potato famine is another example of how primitive agricultural practices, this time by Irish peasants, is going to lead to a famine and an inability to produce food, which will result in massive Irish death and migration. And then the Hungry 40s, just in general, there is a climactic downturn and it hurts harvests. And so there is going to be, pretty widespread hunger going on in the 1840s. All right, so that is it for 6.2. Now we'll move on to 6.3, which is going to deal with the second wave of industrialization, otherwise known as the Second Industrial Revolution, and we will look at its effects. So the big picture topic here is that there is going to be increasing innovation and technological growth, and that is going to lead to economic and social changes, right? So our big focus here, at least initially in 6.3, is what does the increasing technology, how does the increasing technology affect the way that people work and live? All right, so first of all, the biggest economic change is going to be the rise of the factory system. Right? By 1914, the end of this time period, the factory system is the predominant way in which goods are produced, which is a remarkable change from what things had been like before the 1815 time period. Prior to this, if you remember, in the old regime, you had the family economy. The family was the basic unit of production. People worked within their families, in their homes. There was not a separation between work and home life. That's all going to change. The factory system is going to remove the husband from the wife, the kids from the parents, and it's going to remove work from the home. So that is the biggest change that we see. Manchester, England is a great example of this. It's going to become one of the leading industrial urban areas in all of Europe. Also, the Krupp family in Germany are going to be these huge, very wealthy family that owns lots of factories and are titans of industry, the Rockefellers, the Carnegies of Germany, if you want a little A-push reference there. Now, the new technologies that we see are going to really make a difference when it comes to transportation and communication. So there's going to be major changes economically and socially from these new transportation and communication devices. So transportation is going to cause many things to happen, right? And so let's talk about some examples of transportation. The railroad is going to become an increasingly important part of European life. Steamships, steamboats, whatever you want to call them. The internal combustion engine will eventually lead to the automobile. They are going to change the way in which goods are transported, in which people have access to move, and that's going to change life. And then the communication changes we see, the telegraph, the telephone, the radio, it's going to allow for mass communication. All right, so what do these new changes do economically? Well, the first thing they do is they create a unified national economy. Now you can link places together within a nation through transportation, railroad lines, and communication, and so they can all contribute to a national economy. It's not going to be localized like it once was. Also, we're going to see increasing urbanization. This urbanization is going to be aided by the transportation and communication that is going on. And we are also going to see that the global economic network that has been growing since the 1700s that we've been talking about is only going to get bigger and bigger as Europeans have the ability to enter into new markets, to more quickly ship goods and interact with other parts of the world. So we'll see new technology and innovations in manufacturing and industrial practices as well, not just in transportation. The Bessemer process is going to allow for cheaper and easier and faster and better production of steel. We are going to see just mass production of goods on a wide level. And of course, transportation will allow for those goods to reach new markets. The development of electricity is going to transform urban living. And the use of chemicals in certain industrial processes are going to create new products that will really change the way in which people are living. All right, now, these new transportation models and this new industrial processes are going to lead to easier access to goods for people, which is going to increase consumerism and increase the standard of living as measured by the amount of material goods that a person can possess. And so some of the things we're going to see during this time that come about because of these new industrial processes are department stores and advertising and the creation of mail-in catalogs and things like that. Producers now have the ability to mass produce goods. They have to convince the consumer that they need to buy those things. And that's what advertising does. Department stores make it easy to obtain, these products. Catalogs can be mailed to a person's home so that you can highlight the things that they must have, right? We are going to see railroads increase the ability of people to travel. We are going to see refrigeration will allow for more food to last longer. The creation of bicycles are going to give people recreational opportunities and mobility that they didn't have before. And so we'll see all of these things changing the way that people live. And then new jobs are created in the new industrial economy. There is going to be jobs in chemical industries, in electricity and energy fields, in automobile construction, in travel, leisure travel, and in sporting events. So society becomes much more modern looking. It begins to resemble how our lives are today, and all of this is happening because of industrialization. Okay, that was the first big picture for this one. The second big picture thought about the second industrial revolution is the influence that industrialization has on the political developments that are going to take place during this time period. All right, and so the Industrial Revolution has political and economic effects as well as economic social effects. So basically what we are going to see is that industrialization creates more complex economies, more areas that industrialization occurs in, and what that is going to do is it's going to be caused by, governments being involved in industrial decisions. Basically, governments are going to incentivize and develop programs and policies that steer a country towards industrialization. A good example of this is Prussia. Prussia is going to become the leading German state during this time because they will enthusiastically adopt industrial practices and policies. They will build tons of railroad lines. They will encourage what is known as a Zollverein. Zollverein is the economic union of the German states, reducing tariffs, allowing for goods, capital, products, all these things to flow across German boundaries. Germany is not united at this time, right? So there are 38 German states, I believe. Each of them had tariffs and barriers to trade and things like that. And so Prussia is going to encourage this Zollverein to try and create like a free trade state amongst the German states. What we will also see is that Prussia's actions to become a great industrial power are going to transform it into the most powerful German state, which will then allow them to be the leaders of German unification later on, that we'll get into, I believe, in Unit 7. Okay, so another feature that we see of a growing industrial society is that the capitalist economic system has its boom and bust periods, its ups and downs. And what we are going to see is that in the late 19th century in particular, the late 1800s, just like in the United States, you have the Panic of 1873 and general economic turmoil, you're going to have the same things going on in Europe. And so we are going to see monopolies be created. We are going to see all sorts of corporate growth and then government reaction to those sorts of things. And so monopolies will form, and maybe you'll get anti-monopoly legislation or antitrust legislation. Tariffs are going to be passed to try to protect internal economies. We're going to see increasingly complex banking and credit things going on within the economies. And so generally speaking, as we develop as an industrial society, there's going to be more government management of the economy, and more corporate innovation that is taking place within society. All right, and we'll come back and talk about that a little bit more later on. But basically, we're going to see a shift where most people previously had talked about laissez-faire economics. Now, with an increasingly industrial and complex economy, there's going to be a call for greater government oversight of that. But we'll get back to that. So like I had mentioned, industry is going to raise the quality of life. We are going to see population growth occur during this time, a steady population increase as the commercialization of agriculture, as the adoption of more advanced agricultural techniques take place. Population grows because food is much more steady. We are also going to see a rising life expectancy and a decrease in the amount of infant mortality. We will also see a lowering of birth rate as society becomes more urban. Less children are produced in the families. There's not space for them, nor is there a need like there was in a traditional economy. And so we see smaller families and a lowering birth rate, but also a declining death rate. And so population is going to grow at first, but eventually it's going to reach that equilibrium point. All right, and then we are also going to see advanced or increased amounts of consumerism, ads, catalogs, department stores, selling things like clothing, processed foods, labor-saving devices. These are all going to become popular items that make life easier and are going to be widely available to the vast majority of people. And then there's going to be more leisure time, and so leisure time is going to develop. The weekend becomes a thing. That was a creation of industrial times. Going to the movies or going to the theater or going to museums, things like that are going to occur as well. Okay, that's 6.3. Now let's talk about 6.4, our last topic, and thankfully, according to my notes, the shortest part of industrialization that we have to talk about, the social effects of industrialization. So, you got to look at the social effects, the social causes and effects of industrialization. What happens because of industry and industrial development to European society? The number one most important thing, and I don't mean to sound like a Marxist here, is the development of class consciousness. As we know, because we read the Communist Manifesto, the bourgeoisie versus the proletariat, as Marx likes to talk about. This is the most obvious new development that we see in European society, that one's identity is tied to what position they have in the industrial economy. Are you bourgeois? Are you proletariat? Are you a factory owner or a factory worker, to put it in real basic sort of terms? And so we're going to see this become a clear societal issue, this class consciousness, this burgeoning class consciousness that forms especially in urban areas in Western Europe. Now, in Eastern Europe, we're going to see a persistence, a continuity from earlier of agricultural elites and serfs. It won't be the same sort of class consciousness. Number two, middle class identity, right? The middle class, the bourgeoisie, are going to come to be the most important and influential social class that exists in the 19th century. And they are going to pursue various things, right? Middle class identity, the family, it's going to be the nuclear family living in their private residence, the cult of domesticity, the man is the breadwinner, the woman stays home and raises the children, that the woman shouldn't be involved in economic matters, that the one income family is the optimal family that you can have. Women will often find outlets for participation in society through philanthropy. Oftentimes, middle-class women will be very involved in issues that are tied to religious organizations or that are charitable towards working-class women. They're going to be big in the temperance movement. They're going to be big in the Sunday school movement, which attempts to provide schooling and literacy to working-class children. And then they're also going to join political and social associations that represent their interests. And basically, the major political parties during this time are going to form the Conservatives and Labour in Britain, for example. And they're going to be mass-based political parties, meaning they're going to try to appeal to as much of the electorate as they can. Well, early on in industrialization, most societies have property requirements on voting, and so the political parties are going to represent the interests of the bourgeoisie, the commercial elite, those sorts of people. Now, the working class are going to develop their own identity as well. Joining trade unions is going to be an important part. Union activity, collectivizing to bargain as a whole to get better wages, less hours, safer conditions, those sorts of things. We'll also see the rise of socialist parties that deal with educating voters, getting voters out, creating parties that address issues for the working class, which will be important because the working class will be the biggest sector of urban society by the end of the 19th century. We are also going to see mutual aid societies formed where working class people deal with issues and try and make their lives better as well. All right, urbanization is going to grow during this time period. We become more and more urban as a society, and that is going to lead to overcrowding and issues that are associated with that. And so we are going to see the cities have issues with sanitation, pollution, and crime, and overcrowding, and all these things that are sort of associated with early industrialization. We will come back and talk about the reforms that are made to improve the conditions of life inside the urban areas a little bit later on. Also, the increasingly urban society is going to make agricultural areas suffer labor shortages sometimes, and certainly a loss of community. And a lot of literature later on, which we'll get to, deal with life in the city where you become just a face in the crowd. The sort of alienation and loneliness of modern urban life is going to become a recurring theme, right? And so there's that loss of identity, loss of traditional life, which is going to have a big impact on people. All right, so now we get to the reforms, right? The reforms of the industrial age are going to lead to an increased standard of living for all people, but especially the working class. We're going to see a bunch of laws passed that regulate economic activity for the working class. The Factory Act of 1833, the Mines Act of 1842, and the 10-Hour Act of, I can't remember, are going to limit the amount of work and the type of work that women and children can be involved in. We are going to see a rise in wages, a beginning of welfare systems to provide a safety net for people who are victims of capitalist, tumult in the economy. We are going to see improvements in diet as refrigeration allows for foods to last longer and for foods to be shipped from further away. And we are going to see the beginnings, or not really the beginnings, but the continuation and development of new birth control practices that allow for regulation of when and where a couple procreates. We are also going to see that leisure time is going to grow, as we talked about. It's going to be more individual or within the family as opposed to communal as it had been in early European times. Parks, sporting events, what did I write there? Museums, theaters, and some word I wrote that I can't read are all going to become part of new industrial new leisure activities an industrial society will partake in. And the family is going to be reimagined. We will see that as opposed to economics being the key decider for marriage, it will now become companionate, soulmate, looking for that sort of thing. The fools didn't know that, of course, you find your soulmate through reality TV. Everyone knows that now, but they didn't have TV back then, so they tried to base it on, that idea of like romantic love as opposed to the economic considerations that had made up most of marriage at that time. All right, so that's it for now. We are going to come back and talk about this when we look at liberals and socialists and all that fun stuff is coming. So there's going to be more talk about this as we get there. But this is probably my longest video, so let's just call it quits. I'll talk to you guys later.